Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. What you can see behind me now is code that I wrote several years ago. I won't be disclosing exactly how many, but I will be sharing 5 things that to me indicate that a person who wrote certain code might not be very experienced, and I will be sharing some best practices which can help you avoid these 5 things and help you produce more clean, efficient, and high quality code for your website. So if you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. The first thing that I want to talk about is naming. And I'm talking about this first because if you only watch part of this video and this is the only thing that you take away, this is what I would want you to take away. And it's also probably the easiest thing to actually implement from all of the topics that I'm going to talk about in this video. And issues with naming, in my opinion, stem from the fact that you don't understand that you're writing this code not for computers, but for humans. Okay, so your code is going to be read either by your future self or by other people on your team or by another developer that takes over, but your code needs to be easily understood by human beings. And by not naming, you are essentially making your code almost unintelligible or at least really, really hard to work with for both your future self and for other people on your team, possibly. And let me just hop in and point out what I'm talking about. So when I take a look at some website code, I take a look around and see if I can see anything like what we see right over here. Okay, so you can see here it says text 291, column strip 8, button 57, image 35, drop down 3. Okay, and if I hop over to the elements here on my screen and I just select one, so you can see this one is called drop down 3. And this one is called input 23. So if I am currently, let's say, looking for the topic input in my code, then I really have no idea how to find it unless I go into my page and I select the element and I go and I see, okay, this is input 23, and then I go and I search for that input 23 here in the code. But if I'm taking a look at the code, I really have no way of knowing what element this code is referring to. So I see here, for example, button 57 gets disabled. Okay, how do I find button 57 now on my page? How do I understand which button is being disabled? And this can become even more complex if I have different elements overlapping each other. Some of the elements can be hard to find or select, even using all of the tools that we have. So that's why it's super, super important to name your elements. And not only elements, I'll talk about a few other things related to naming, but I think this is really, really the foundation. As soon as you put an element on your screen, on your canvas, and you're referencing it in your code. I'm not saying you have to name things that are not being referenced in your code. Like, for example, if I have this section over here, so column strip 8, I think I did reference that in my code. But let's say this text, okay? Let's say this book and event title. It's not something that I change with code, so I don't think that it's necessary to go in and necessarily change the naming here because you're not referencing in your code. But anything that you are going to reference in your code, for example, this drop down 3, so I would want to give this a significant and meaningful name. So for example, here I have topic. So instead of calling it input 23, I would want to go in and go right over here to the side and rename this and call this, let's say, topic input. Okay, so I know it's related to topic. I know it's going to be an input. And you can think of different naming conventions that work for you. I'm not going to say that how I do it in terms of what name I give is the only right way, but the fact that I give it a meaningful name that will be easy for me to take a look at my code and understand exactly what element is referring to is super important. I personally, okay, we're getting into the personal range here. I personally like to not use any kind of shortening or, you know, time-saving ways of writing the names, and this goes for both the IDs, but it also goes for variables and function names and everything I'm going to talk about in a moment. So for example, I would choose to call this topic input and not, for example, T input. Okay, T, obviously, T is short for topic. Trust me. I mean, personally, tomorrow I wouldn't remember that, but maybe you have a really good memory, so you'll forget after a week. but it'll be really hard to understand your code if you try and like shorten things or like topic. Okay, so topic maybe not, but like input, yeah, sure. I can shorten input to like int, okay, or something like that. And while it saves maybe 2 characters, it's just going to make it really hard for you to actually read your code and understand what's written there. And you'll be saving yourself a lot of time and effort if you just write clear naming for your elements. So that is the first thing that I take a look at code, and within a second, I can tell, okay, was this code written by somebody who's experienced, by somebody who understands the importance of naming conventions, or was it written by somebody who, again, kudos to you for trying to write code on your website, but doesn't really have much experience with writing code. So the second red flag is the incorrect or lack or complete lack of using functions in your code. So let's take a look here at this embarrassing code that I wrote. And we can see here that we start the page code over here. So it's on ready function. It says function, but that's not even a function that I wrote. That's built in. And then we go on to all of these lines of code, which have, I mean, it's like hurting my eyes just to look at it. But you'll see here, you'll notice that nowhere are there any functions declared, and my code just kind of all runs inside of the onReady from beginning to end, and it ends right over here, and we have not had one function declared inside the entire code. Okay, so when I see something like that, that is like, whoa. Okay. And let's talk a bit about what the importance of separating things into functions is. So, first thing is if I have code that is going to repeat itself. So, if I had something here, which I do several times again and again, I'm not sure that there is something here specifically that would fit that use case, but if you do have something that is going to be happening again and again, it would make sense to separate it into a function so that you can just call that function instead of kind of repeating lines of code again and again. So that is one use for functions. Another one is to break your code into bite-sized, understandable snippets and divide responsibility for different things between different functions. So here you can see that that is obviously lacking, and it also creates a situation where it's very hard for me to understand what each part of my code is responsible for doing because it's not bunched into a function which has a name which clearly describes what it's supposed to be doing. Okay, so just to give you an example of how functions can be used here, I mean, there's everything here could be separated into a function, but let's take, for example, just right over here. So you can see that I've implemented some logic in my code, which runs if the user is logged in. Okay, so if the user is logged in, everything that's under here is going to run essentially. And let me go down and find where the else statement is all the way down here. I mean, I hope this already highlights why this code is like a disaster. But here we have the code that runs if the else statement, if we enter the else statement. So if the member is not logged in, this is the code that's supposed to run. So one thing that I could do here is I could, instead of having the code just running over here, I could go ahead down here, let's say, and declare a function. And notice how I'm like building this function outside of the onReady, which also helps kind of clean up the code instead of having everything all inside of the onReady. And I'm going to call this, so I'm going to say function, and I'll say handle user not logged in. Okay. And we don't need to pass in any parameters here because I don't see anything here that's contingent on a parameter. And I could just grab all this code right here, put this inside of the function, and then call this handle user not logged in right over here. And then if I was reading through my code, it would be much easier for me to figure out just by looking right over here what this code is actually responsible for, because otherwise, okay, so yeah, here I have the text that says you need to log in before you can book an event, but I would really need to go all the way back up and take a look at the if statement, understand what the logic that's being implemented there is. And here it's much more clear to me, okay, this is handle user not logged in. And moreover, if there was another place in my code theoretically where I had to handle the fact that the user's not logged in, I could call this same function there as well. Okay, so that's just really a very simple example of how to extract a function and why it's so useful. You'll notice something else here that has to do a bit with what I talked about before, which is naming. And I really like to use very long function names that are very descriptive. Just note that if your function name includes more than one action, it's probably an indication that your function can be broken up into other parts. So for example, if this function was handle user not logged in and then redirect to somewhere and then in all in your function name, that's an indication that, okay, maybe this function is actually too big. But generally, I do like longer, more descriptive function names that start with a verb. Okay, so handle, get, uh, do, go, I don't know, like some kind of verb to start with in order to indicate that it's a function and it's something's happening. Okay, so that is a bit about functions. And now I want to talk about the third red flag, which has to do with the backend. Okay, so red flag number 3 is the non-use or misuse of backend code in Wix. So let me take a step back because I'm aware that some people might not know what the backend even is, and that probably is what leads to a lot of these not ideal code bases. So first of all, the backend is essentially code that runs server side. So it's not code that you're sending to the client. It's not JavaScript like the page code, which person can just go into their browser and actually read the code that you wrote on the page. It's code that's stored securely on the server and runs with your own custom logic, and it can help you essentially protect your data and access also third-party APIs and stuff like that. And I tend to use it for almost any interaction that I'm having with my data collections. I'm not saying that it is wrong to just have a plain query on the front end. If you have your permissions set up correctly and you know what you're doing, then you're good. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as running a query on the front end, but in many use cases, it is relevant and sometimes even necessary to have your code living on the back end. So let me just give some examples of where I see that problem here in this code base. So here, for example, I mean, you can see that I'm running, first of all, a bunch of queries here on the front end, and I'm querying the members collection to see if I have a certain user there. And again, depending on the permissions of that member collection, this is also just to clarify, this members collection is not the Wix members collection. This is like a collection that I set up that's just has the name members. And the fact that I can query the members collection and run a query using user email to see if I can find someone is a bit of an indication that my permissions for this collection might not be set up correctly, and I'm potentially exposing the data in the collection also to somebody who shouldn't have access to it. Because if I have a collection called members, as you can imagine, it might include some private member data that I only want the actual member that owns that data to have access to. And in order to give those protections in an advanced way, I would essentially need to move this code into the backend and build a backend function that I would call from the front end. So how would this look, just to give you an idea? So instead of having my code live over here, I would go to public and backend. And you can see here that I do have some backend code written. So it's not like I didn't know what the backend at all was when I wrote this code. Maybe I just wasn't aware of this specific use case or the importance of permissions on collections. But often I see people who don't use this backend at all, which usually indicates that they either don't know how to use it or they don't know it exists. And that's a bit of a problem in many use cases of Velo. So to create a new backend file, sorry, you'll go right over here and you'll click the plus button. And nowadays you'll add in a new web module instead of the JSW files, which are being deprecated, but that's not the topic of this tutorial. So I just add in a new web module, and I would call this, for example, or I'd call this, let's say, members. And then here inside of this file, I would write the logic that I had on the front end. Okay, so I would write a function over here, which essentially would be, let's say, get member. And then here it would be, let's say, I could even change this to permissions site member, and that would mean only logged in members can actually access this function. So it's like an additional layer of protection. And then in here, I would essentially write the actual logic of the function, which could run that same query that I had in the front end and send over whatever data. And if I put in the correct logic, then I would essentially be protecting the data in my collection from being accessed on the front end, assuming that I had set the correct permissions on that collection. And I won't delve into it too much here because I do have other tutorials which explain, data collections and permissions and queries and everything more in depth. But I just wanted to point out that if you're not using the backend at all, chances are um, you should be. So yeah, I'm not, again, there are use cases for Velo code where you're doing something really simple, like behavioral based, and you don't have any use for the backend. But definitely seeing code written like this on the front end, where it's pretty clear that there's some misuse of permissions and access to member data, that is usually a red flag that something is amiss. Okay, so congrats for making it this far. We are at number 4, and number 4 has to do with something called promises. And this, again, I see a lot in code that I look at different people's websites. And what is a promise, first of all? So a promise is essentially an asynchronous action that happens over time and has to be handled in a special way in your code. So just for example, over here, let's take a look at this dot then. And you'll see that a lot in the Wix documentation, and I think that's why a lot of amateur code looks like this. Essentially, whatever happens inside of this dot then is happens only after the resolution of the promise. And if we scroll down somewhere, we might see, if we're lucky, this might be in the stage before I even knew what catch was. But I think I saw one here before. Yeah, so here we have something dot catch, and that's essentially going to run if the promise throws an error or doesn't resolve. And what this promise is essentially it's an action that takes some time, and that's why we need to handle the result of that promise in its own unique logic. Okay, so here we're querying the members collection. That's something that takes time. So I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to get back these results. So I need to wait for those results and run my logic of what's going to happen once I get those results back inside its own dot then. Okay, so that is one way to resolve a promise, and this is usually um, what I tend to see in less experienced code writers' code, uh, and it leads to something called like callback hell or promise hell or whatever name you want to give it. But here, essentially, you can see that I have one dot then, and then I'm resolving another promise within that promise. So it's another dot then and another dot then, and it leads to this code, which is kind of like this huge pyramid of code that's happening inside each other. And it makes it harder to read, harder to use, harder to reuse. Lots of bad things, okay? So again, it's not incorrect to use dot then, but I think that more experienced coders would most likely prefer a more modern approach, which is using something called async await. So for example, here, where we have this query, okay, so I'm querying here for the members, and then we have dot then. So if I was to transfer this into async await, then instead of writing it like this, it would be written something like this. Okay, so here I would have const results. Okay, so whatever I'm expecting to come back from my promise equals to await and whatever my promise is. So this query right over here, you can see that the await keyword is highlighted in red, and that's because this needs to essentially be wrapped in a function, which is asynchronous. So I would have to have here async function. And this also has to do with the lack of use of functions. So if you don't really know how to use functions, it'll be harder for you to use async await. even though it is a better way of handling promises. And you'll tend to lean towards using .then when you don't really know how to build functions. And then this all would have to go inside of this. And now you can see here, obviously I would call my function something else, not name. It would be like, get member. And here you can see now that the await keyword um, is not underlined in red, so it's working. And typically you'd want to wrap this in something called a try catch in order to make sure that you catch any errors, just like we did. So here you'd handle the error. Okay, just like we did down there in the dot catch that I showed you for the dot then. Okay, so it's a different syntax, but essentially doing the same thing. And if I don't see any of this in somebody's code and I see a lot of dot then, dot then, dot then, and nested and nested and nested, that is usually an indication of that there's still some learning to be done for the code writer. Another thing that I see is sometimes the opposite, which usually is like for intermediate level code writers, that they use async await in places that they don't necessarily need it. So there's something that in their mind takes time, let's say, something like a complex function, let's say, so they'll use async await even though there isn't actually a promise being resolved. So that's something that I also see, but it's a little more rare. It's hard for me to give an exact example because it's like it just comes up sometimes. But that can also sometimes catch my eye and be like, okay, what's going on here? Yeah, so that is the fourth thing that I tend to see in less experienced coders' code bases. Okay, the last thing that I would like to talk about is comments. And this is divided into two parts. So first of all, you'll have comments like the one you can see here in this code base, which is essentially code that I had written previously and I decided is no longer necessary, so I commented it out essentially. And this is essentially a sign of lack of confidence because I am unsure about my code to the extent that I'm hanging on to old code that I wrote just because what if I need that in the future? What if I decide to go back? What if? And yes, there are stages where it makes sense to comment out code and leave it there in the development stage of the code. But this is code that I haven't touched for years. And you can see that there's still just code which is commented out, obviously not in use, obviously not necessary, but I was too afraid to erase it because what if I need it? What if the new code that I wrote isn't good? What if I forget? What if? So somebody who is confident in their code or confident in rewriting code that they've written before, if they need to again, you won't see this kind of stuff going on in their code. Okay, this again, unless it's like they're exactly in the testing stage where they just commented something out to see how it would work without it, and they're making sure, and then they just go back and erase it. Yes, I'm not saying there's no use for comments at all, but for an established code base to have huge chunks of code commented out like this is usually a sign that there's something not so right. And that's one kind of comment. The other kind of comment is, oh, I see one right over here. I was going to say that I didn't see many of them here in the code, but it's comments like this one. Okay, so you can see here it's a comment that's kind of explaining the code. So set fields for events, or here it's hard to tell because there's other commented out code after it. But here we have, let's say, find end date. Let me see if I can find another example for you here. Here, okay, so create a schmooze. Don't ask me what a schmooze is. It's very specific to this website. But just basically code that is comments that are explaining what your code does. And this I see even with upper intermediate, advanced, because it's also a topic which is a bit in contention. So it's a bit opinionated as to if you should, what the attitude towards writing these kinds of comments are. But generally, from what I've seen, and my personal approach is to have little to no comments in your code once it's at a finished stage. So it's okay to like maybe write a comment as a note, as a to-do, or this, needs to be addressed later on. But what tends to happen with comments is that one, it puts you in a position where you don't feel as obligated to write understandable code because, oh, I have the comment there that's explaining my code. So you kind of let yourself off in terms of the effort that you put into making your code intelligible, and really good code should explain itself. So I should be able, by just looking at the code, to understand that this is the general event save. And if I don't understand that from the code, then that's probably an indication that I didn't do such a great job naming and stuff like that. Another reason that comments can be problematic is that you can write a comment and then make changes to the code that the comment is referencing without actually changing the comment, which essentially creates incorrect documentation of what's going on in your code and can mislead yourself in the future or other people addressing your code. So that is another kind of thing you need to be careful about with writing comments. Again, I'm not going to say that if I see like one comment in code, then that means like, oh, this person doesn't know what they're doing. And that's also like a slightly opinionated approach about comments. But if I see a lot of comments in the code, it makes me think, okay, maybe this person is not so confident in the code that they wrote to the extent that they think that somebody else will understand just by looking at the code. Other scenarios that might be possible is that, for example, if I'm a developer and I'm writing code for a client and I want them to be able to go in and easily understand a certain part of the code and what it's responsible for without having to call me and make changes, and they don't read code at all, then that could be a place that a comment might be relevant. So again, don't say like, oh, Eitan said no comments, so like quickly, like, yeah, but just think for yourself. And it is something that I look at when I'm looking at a code base to try and understand what the skill level of the person who wrote the code is. Okay, so with that, we are going to wrap up for today. And obviously, there is a lot more that can be talked about in terms of writing good, clean code and best practices. And it's something also that I'm personally evolving in and learning all the time. I'm sure if somebody who's been writing code for 10 years takes a look at my code now, they might also catch certain things that doesn't seem 100% right to them or that I can improve, just like I am looking at my own code from several years ago see a lot of mistakes that I'm quite embarrassed about, but I think it's important to share with you and to show you kind of the progress that you can make and things that you can easily fix in your code, even if you're not such an advanced coder. So these weren't such complex aspects, maybe backend code a little bit, maybe promises are more complex, but I think stuff like naming conventions and use of functions is something that even beginners can wrap their heads around and should please I highly recommend use in their code. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Leave me a comments with either one of the five that you were like, oh my gosh, that's me. I totally need to fix that, or something that you think is like a super important thing that I missed. I'd be very curious to hear about either of those two things or any comments or questions that you have. And if you want to see more content like this about Velo, Wix, coding in general, then please subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.